Good morning. Good to see you all. Let's start with our opening prayer, kind of center ourselves. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Lord Jesus Christ, open the eyes of my heart that I may hear your word and understand and do your will, for I am a sojourner upon the earth. Hide not your commandments from me, but open my eyes, that I may perceive the wonders of your law. Speak unto me the hidden and secret things of your wisdom. On you do I set my hope, O my God, that you shall enlighten my mind and understanding with the light of your knowledge, not only to cherish those things which are written, but to do them. For you are the enlightenment of those who lie in darkness, and from you comes every good deed and every gift. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, good morning. So last week we got just through 14 and to the beginning of 15, and one of the things that Martyn and I were saying last week, and we just kind of want to pick up that theme this week, is the way that now with the Passion narratives, we are not really just taking little stories or lessons and trying to understand them, but we're really entering into this walk, this passion with Jesus. It's like the events themselves are the point, not what's said or anything. And there's very little interpretation here. There's just these extraordinarily important actions. And so from the very beginning of Christianity, from the beginning of the church, so going back to the 300s or the 4th century, when Christianity stops being illegal and becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, from that time, people have wanted to imagine, enact, travel to the Holy Land, find these stops, find these stations, as eventually they came to be called, and sort of enter into this moment. And so I just want us to reflect a little bit at the beginning about that idea, that we want to be part of this. So this illustration here is just like some little carved stations of the cross that you could buy on Etsy. These aren't like famous from some church somewhere. These are somebody's thing that they're selling. But over many centuries, this has been standardized, this walk in the Catholic Church, into 14 stations. If you look at these, you might recognize them. Not all of these are in the Gospels. Jesus never falls in any of the Gospels. That's right. So imagine why over many, many centuries, the tradition that Jesus was falling enters in to our imagination, right? We want to walk alongside him. We want to imagine ourselves there, seeing that vulnerability and that pain and that frailty. So, but that is not in any of the Gospels. Some of the other episodes are, of course, Jesus' death, Jesus being taken down from the cross, although we have in the Gospel Joseph of Arimathea taking him down, and many times that's not how it's portrayed. Jesus meeting his mother comes early in the stations of the cross, usually I think number 4, but he only meets his mother in the Gospel of John when she's standing at the foot of the cross. So, this isn't necessarily, I guess what I'm trying to say is to think about how this isn't just a faithful, well, let's take the gospel, what happened, let's carve it, let's put it in a statue, a piece of art, but this is, the imagination of millions of people have also created this, and the imagination of people who want to walk along this path. So St. Francis of Assisi was a big part of this, and started this idea, not the modern idea of the stations, but really wanted people to be able to walk this path. And St. Francis was also known for setting up nativity scenes and creches. So Francis was not, he's my favorite, but he was not a big intellectual, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, writing treatises type of person. Francis was walking the walk, right? He put himself in the spaces, and Francis, by tradition, and as far as I know, is the first person to have received the stigmata, so his body is taking on this passion too. So really, if you think about Francis and the stations as part of an embodied Christianity that walks alongside the Gospels, isn't separate from it, but isn't identical with it either. We've wanted this text, but we've also wanted, as Christians, I say we've wanted this experience, right? To be present with this experience. And so the Stations of the Cross are that. And by the 18th century, it starts really early. We were in Bologna at Christmas time visiting our son, and Bologna has this set of 7 churches that is built. One of them is built as an imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a very early sort of walking this Via Dolorosa, this way of sorrow in Bologna. This is going all the way back, but this standardized 14 stations in every church we've had at least for 200 or 300 years in the Catholic tradition and other traditions as well. Did you want to say more about that?
Yeah. So, can everybody hear me? Is that coming through? The Stations of the Cross is something we encounter in really any Catholic church that we go into, and that wasn't something that I grew up with. But it's sort of to me, it's kind of an anchoring experience of going into a Catholic church. Is look on the side walls, or in whatever fashion the church is set up, you'll see these stations on the side. So right from the get-go, as you sit in there, and I'm like it. Wasn't that was I've mentioned before I was raised evangelical, but that presence of these stations and the story of the Passion wasn't present in that kind of in that way. So it's for our tradition, it's something that is called to attention and called to mind. And then when these passages come up, we read these during Easter. We read this as a big section. Right, and it's interactive, where the congregation reads and the priest will read parts, and we'll have readers up there doing different sections. So we read this as a big chunk. So I think that's part of what Karen's saying is it's not something that is interpretive. What does this mean? What does this saying mean? It's the accumulation of the whole thing. So we're going to imitate that a little bit today as we go through. Try to cover some ground here. Steve.
There are 14. No, at one time there were 7. In Bologna, there were 7 when it was first. And then but the standardized 14 has been in place for at least several hundred years. Yeah. And, we expect this if we're Catholics and we go to a shrine, if we go to a place, a church, a cathedral, a country church, we know this is going to be there. It's almost, we don't, I don't know, I always look for it because I'm interested to see what kind of stations do they have here, wherever I go. So I thought we might start with just instead of reflecting on the text, thinking for a few minutes about our experience of the Stations of the Cross. Is this something that was important to you growing up or is still important to you? Do have you ever thought about the idea that we have this sort of way of wanting to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem right in our very churches, wherever we are, that we have this desire to walk along this path and what that might be coming from? Let's just see if there are any thoughts about the Stations of the Cross.
So just reflect
on that
for a few minutes, and we're going to get the sweep of this in just a moment, but reflect on the Stations of the Cross. Has it meant a lot to you, or is it something that kind of...
Do you have memories of it? Anything
you
want to share about that? Sounds like we've got a lot of memories of the stations. That's kind of fun to think about. Does anyone want to share with the group any experiences of the stations that have been important to them over the years? Yes,
Sheila.
Sheila.
Every week it was said from a different point of view. And the one from Mary, oh my goodness, they had women reading the parts. And I got to be one of, oh, your voice just cracks, it's so emotional. Especially when you look at it from a different point of view. I thought that was
Yeah, it can be a really emotional experience to be, and that's an imaginative thing and an empathy, right, for the sorrow of the women, of Mary, of the other women, and putting yourself in that place. You can feel it. It's really entering into the story in a very, personal way.
And if I could add to that too, the extent, for most of the gospel, Jesus is an actor and doing things. And then here in the Passion, it switches around and people are doing things to him. And we become watchers as readers in this. And so I think what you're saying too is we enter into that imaginatively from a lot of different angles. What if we were Mary? What if we saw this as so-and-so? What if we saw this in this direction? So it's kind of asking us to enter imaginatively in creative ways even.
Yeah. My mother, who passed away almost 2 years ago, she was a writer and also spent 30 or 40 years in prison ministry, and she wrote a Stations of the Cross for the women in the prison where she worked, and it was written with the deep knowledge of their experiences and for them, to be able to imagine themselves not just as, outsiders to this story, but participants and feeling that, solidarity and empathy with this path. So I think that's one of the things that's so beautiful about it. It can be adapted, and the emphasis of it can be changed depending on the context or depending on who's praying it. Yeah.
Other memories that you had, Sue?
Just what you said about how it can be adapted for all different ones. I was sharing that when I was teaching, I taught kindergarten, and I would take my kindergartners over to church every Lent or every Lent, and take them around the stations and just tell the story briefly, not get real involved, but just bring up that Jesus had to go through all this just because he was a good man, and there are people that didn't like the way he was loving other people and showing them how to treat each other, putting it down on their level. So that's another aspect that even young children can get into the story, and I also wanted them to be able to come into church and have something to look at, because so often they're sitting and then they start getting wiggly and stuff, but if they notice those, maybe they could, remember part of the story and
Yes.
go along with it.
Yes, so interesting. So we've had imagine from the perspective of Mary, but then children as well. That's another way to look and to see this.
Two things. The first of all, I remember on our trip to the Holy Land they always take you on the way of the cross
Yes.
as part of this tour. Again, it was impressive to actually go through the narrow streets and the cobblestones. The other part is our daughter is named Veronica,
Yes.
and one of the Stations of the Cross, the wife, the faith of Jesus. That's not in the gospel.
No.
It's not in any of them.
Not in any.
It's not in, not in any of them. So, but so that must have been something put in to why was the name given? Is it representing all women?
Yeah.
Well, Veronica means true image. That's the meaning of the name. So, it's this is what's so beautiful about our tradition. Like, it's not that, well, that's not in the gospel, so that's not true. It's true on such a deep sense that people loved him and that he loved others and that people were watching and participating with this. Whether there ever was a real woman named Veronica who wiped his face, there was. But, and I also think that even though we're here for Bible study, the text isn't everything in this tradition. The text is part and the heart of it, but the experience, the art, the traditions, the memories, the emotions, that goes with this text.
But why put a name to that?
Well,
the name, so one way to think about that would be that the early church has these icons that they, in this case, the image of Jesus puts his face on that cloth, and then there's miraculously an image that's left on that, and that is maybe preserved in a church or becomes popular in some way, and then the name Veronica
means true image. So you're going to name this person after the event with, that's like if a person is named,
goal scorer, or
yeah, like true, right, like Braveheart. Well, because they're brave. They become named Braveheart. So that's what it. She didn't have that name before, and
the name is after the image in that case.
Veronica means true image. So, yeah, Heidi.
I just have a question. You might have talked about this in the beginning, but it is fascinating for the number of things that are maybe biblical in here in terms of the writings. What year did they start? Do we know, like, when this tradition of the stations itself, what year that started, and then over time they maybe put, like a name to that white. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so, the desire to go to the Holy Land and walk this path goes back to the 4th century when Christianity became the official religion and was no longer illegal and outlawed. So, but the standardization of it takes much longer. So the desire to travel this is going to be taking place in different, like Bologna in Italy. This is an early example, like maybe 7th or 8th century. In the medieval period, which is St. Francis, that's when pilgrimage becomes really kind of a really central part of the tradition. And part of that is because of you would receive, blessings, and you would be sent on pilgrimage as penance. If you committed a really bad sin, your priest could be like, pack your things. You're not coming back for years. You're going to the Holy Land. That's how bad your sins are. You would go on this, you could be sent on a pilgrimage as part of your penance. Or, then of course that desire would be in many people, well, I can't go to Jerusalem, but I can walk this path here in my village or somewhere down the road. And so I would say, that's when it really becomes kind of a normal part of Christian life. It would be in the medieval period, and then by the early modern 15th, 16th centuries, this is getting into the weeds, but after the Reformation and Protestantism, Catholics really had to systematize a lot of things, like things that were just sort of, well, we do it this way. After the Reformation, Catholics had to kind of say, no, we do it this way, and we got 14 stations, and kind of organize things. So I would say that wouldn't be until the 1600s that we would have this like formal version. But
and
that's
speaking about Jerusalem. It's true when you visit Jerusalem, you have these narrow streets, and then you have these like medals in the wall. And they'll have like Roman numerals. Here's like 6 and 8, and you can walk literally these stations. And that's another way to think about these things that aren't in the Bible that are in the stations is, well, something had to happen along this path, and so this is where he falls. It's not in the Bible, but you can that's something that you need another spot here because you're literally walking along a road, and so you can kind of imaginatively felt, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bob.
So if I understand you correctly, this is something that evolved over a long period of time.
Yes.
It wasn't someone said, this is the way it happened.
Right. Exactly.
Evolved over a millennia and a half of people doing it, right? And so like we have a few documents, and those are all going to come after the 1600s. Papal documents saying no, there's 14, but this lived experience of doing this is going to be something that's very, very ancient and very deep in the Christian kind of experience.
Pat.
There is a relic that is the veil of Veronica in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So it's believed to be.
Yeah.
There's a relic in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome that is believed to be the veil of Veronica.
Yeah, one of our sons is in St. Peter's Basilica right now as we're here, and it's his birthday, and he is on a trip to Italy, and today's the last day, and it's birthday, and I can see his location, and it's like in St. Peter's. So there's something so even about that, that place matters so much in our tradition. Like the idea that our son and his fiance are in St. Peter's right now feels special in some way. Feels a connection. Yes.
I just want to
Kevin.
something out there still. We did a pilgrimage via bus a couple years ago to St. John, Indiana. There's a shrine of Christ's Passion there. Gentleman has spent probably 10 or 12 years building this. It's life-size. He brought rock in to build areas for it. There's interactive things where they'll have voices speaking. But he commissioned an artist out of Texas that put facial expressions in that you cannot describe without seeing.
Huh.
So it's something that we can get to.
Where is that? Okay.
We love those sort of
Yeah,
places.
we love those things. We'll be like heading to Indiana next for sure. Okay, we will. Thank you. Yeah. So okay,
Steve.
Steve.
If I could tell a little bit of a story
Sure.
that links to the end. When I was in grade school, the nuns taught us that when the host is raised after the consecration, to say, "My Lord, my God," and after the cup is raised, to say, "Jesus, for you I live. Jesus, for you I die. Jesus, I'm yours till I come to death." And I began to wonder this past year, where did that come from? Does anybody else know that? I'd asked friends, never heard of it. So I called, this just really got to me, so I called two classmates, a gal and a guy, and they said, "Oh yeah, I remember, we were taught that." And I thought, well, okay, I'm not imagining this. I called the convent. And I talked to the Mother Superior, and she said, "Oh yeah, we all do that here." And I said, "Where did that come from?" She says, "I don't know." I did some research on the web.
Uh-huh.
The last phrase of every station in the Stations by St. Francis Library say that line, or all the people say that at the end of the station.
Interesting.
So those sisters were influenced at some point in the past by that Ligurian tradition. Yeah, and that is a good example of, and we'll have to turn to the text now, but that is a good example of she didn't know, right? She just did it because, and there's so much like that, why Veronica? How did this happen? It's because of the lived experience of thousands and thousands and thousands of people over centuries that give us these traditions. And, for Catholics, that's where the Holy Spirit is moving to, with those sisters and with all of this is God's revelation as well, I would believe. Yes, Steve.
One more quick thing. At the church, Sacred Heart Manitowoc, which is closed now, they have these beautiful stations that were on pedestals that were full carving.
Yeah.
And they were about 12 inches, 14 inches high. And they were beautiful.
Yeah.
Colors.
I
I
love
don't know what happened to them.
I love walking into a church and having a kind of, a local artist or some distinct version of the stations. I think that's a really interesting part about going to a church. One more comment, then we'll read here.
Several years ago, there was a tour of the shroud. And is that, always a great debate.
Right.
And, but in Wisconsin, we were able to see that display. It was a wonderful tour display. It was in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
And I went to go see it. Did anybody else have that experience that they had it?
When the shroud came to Milwaukee. I mean, I would say, for me, one of the interesting things is the way the church is clearly imagining it, but then also, looking for things that came from this experience: the shroud, the napkin, the nails, the true cross. Throughout Christian history, there's been this
crown of
imagination, the crown of thorns. There's been this imagination, but then also, can we find the stuff that brings us into contact with it in some way? So this search for relics.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to turn to the text, because we have the text, but we want to be in contact with these moments. We want to be closer. We want the shroud. We want to walk the walk. We want to have these things, and I think that that's not, it should go without saying, that's not superstition or something. That is part of the Christian experience, and that we're at the heart of it when we read these passion texts. So I'll read the Mark, and then
Okay.
you do the Matthew.
And if we have any doubters, we are hoping to make some progress here. So
So we're
two things. We're gonna read about Pilate and talk about that for just a second, and then we're gonna read the rest of chapter 15. So we're gonna get through with this. Yes, we're gonna do it.
Okay, so this is where we ended last time, and we'll start here at 15:1. As soon as morning came, the chief priests with the elders and the scribes, that is, the whole Sanhedrin, held a council.
And remember, in 14, Jesus has been taken to the Sanhedrin before the Jewish leaders. So that's happened. They have decided that Jesus is blasphemous, and then they send him on to the Romans. So there's these two kind of court scenes or judgment scenes.
They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He said to him in reply, "You say so." The chief priests accused him of many things. Again, Pilate questioned him, "Have you no answer? See how many things they accuse you of?" Jesus gave him no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, on the occasion of the feast, he used to release to them one prisoner whom they requested. A man called Barabbas was then in prison along with rebels who had committed murder in a rebellion. The crowd came forward and began to ask him to do for them as he was accustomed. Pilate answered, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate again said to them in reply, "Then what do you want me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted again, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" They only shouted the louder, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and after he had Jesus scourged, handed him over to be crucified.
All right, so what I want to do is quickly compare Matthew, and there's the scene of Pilate washes his hands, that's in Matthew, and I want to come to kind of a problematic spot within our tradition about, over the centuries and over the years, relations between Christians and Jews, and this story in particular. So here's Mark, and then we're going to look at Matthew dealing with the same question. How is this being filled out in some ways by Matthew, and taken in some directions that would prove to be problematic in Christian history? Here's Matthew. Now, on the occasion of the feast, the governor was accustomed to release to the crowd one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had assembled, Pilate said to them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had handed him over. While he was still seated on the bench, his wife, Pilate's wife, sent him a message. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I suffered much in a dream today because of him." The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas, but to destroy Jesus. The governor said to them in reply, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They answered, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus called Messiah?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." But he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" They only shouted the louder, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he was not succeeding at all, but that a riot was breaking out instead, he took water and washed his hands in the sight of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. Look to it yourselves." And the whole people said in reply, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but after he had Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. So maybe just some sort of starting with some comment from me is that the early church had, who was to blame exactly for Jesus and his crucifixion. And there was, in Mark, we'll come back and talk, what is Mark's opinion on that question? But there was kind of pressure on the church to decide that question. And also the church is trying to expand within the Roman Empire. And you see here a scene that is kind of etched in our mind of Pilate washing his hands of this. And saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood." And one way to understand that is kind of absolving Rome and Pilate of the crime here. That Pilate was a good person. He tried to talk some reason and sense, and that doesn't work. And then the really problematic part is this part. The whole people said in reply, and so here it seems like Matthew, the gospel writer, kind of steps in, and it's not necessary. It's not just the leaders or the people that we've seen opposing Jesus for forever. The whole people said in reply, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." And that has been the problematic part of our tradition. One of the most, I would say, is how do we handle this part, which over time leads to the blood libel, the idea that the Jews as a people, not just the people who were present, but their children are responsible for the death of Jesus.
Yeah, and this goes along with talking about the Stations of the Cross, but in a negative, terrible way, which is that on Good Friday, right, as people were walking and enacting and getting themselves all emotional about this event, these were the times when pogroms and Jews would be killed on Good Friday in revenge for this story. And that happened all the way up until 1940. That was happening that happened on Good Friday in the Czech Republic in 1940. So, this is a very serious thing here that Matthew is doing, and I guess we want to. Did you want to?
Yeah, and then I wanted to kind of just kind of give some context. I think that the church tries really hard to control this these days. So why do we read this as a kind of the priest and then the people and the readers when we're on Easter when we read this whole narrative together? One reason is so that we as a congregation are reading these passages. And that's a way to kind of shift it so that we're not talking about others who did this, but that we are in the position of the Jews and what happened to Christ. So the church, in the way it presents these passages, is often doing some pretty subtle things to move away from this blame version of the text.
Right. That's why we say, they'll be like, crucify him. We all say that together at church. But that hasn't always been the case. That represents movement in the church. And like Father Bill at St. Mary's, he won't even, oftentimes he doesn't say Jews, he says religious leaders, to remind us that it's not them, but it's power, it's envy, it's all of the things that are in all of our hearts that did this. But that hasn't always been the way it's been presented. And
if we go back to Mark now and just think that this is a scene, kind of a cutout scene that Matthew has that the church, I think, has to struggle with. But that is not in Mark. If we just look at the Mark scene, Where is there blame being put, or where would you set the blame as Mark is telling the story? And this is another reason I love Mark. I have definitely become a convert to Mark. But how is Mark dealing with this really tricky question of who's to blame in his passage? So again, let's put Matthew to the side for a second.
Imagine we didn't have Matthew
Yeah.
for a moment. What is Mark doing?
In 11, Mark 11. But the chief priests stirred up.
Exactly.
So the blame was on the chief priests, and they were looking out for their general.
That's right. And I think that's a piece of Mark that's really great, is we've seen Jesus in conflict with the religious leaders of Israel throughout this whole book. And it's the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him, that they are, Pilate's motivation for coming out to the crowd is, well, Jesus is popular. I don't think this guy is really problematic. He's just kind of a weird guy. The crowd loves him. Oh, this will be my excuse to give him back. Then you see the religious leaders come in and stir up the crowd again, to do something different. So, right. In John, yes. Yeah.
Right. So we see this again and again in Mark, that there's a distinction between all of the people and the religious leaders who are trying to hold on to their power. And that is not, by the time of Matthew, we don't see that. It's all of us, right?
And then with Pilate, also in Mark, Pilate wishing to satisfy the crowd. We don't have this, I wash my hands, you do, I can't stop you. It's Pilate wishing to satisfy the crowd. So Pilate is, I think that shows a lack of wisdom and some blame on Pilate's part as well.
In Mark and in Matthew, Pilate gets his wife involved. She's having dreams. We're going to get Pilate off the hook here. And that's in Mark, we don't see that. He doesn't wash his hands.
So this is, we've seen how central this story is, and part of the story is this question of who's to blame. The gospel writers are very in tune to that, and there's a lot of pressures on the church. It'll make things easier on these new congregations in Roman cities if we're not perceived as blaming the Romans for everything that happened. So there's these pressures on the early church. That leads to some, to my mind, passages which over the course of longer history cause a lot of problems between Christians and Jews, really tragic problems. But I feel like Mark is perhaps a really judicious model for how to handle that issue, where he doesn't absolve Pilate, and he also is clear that it's the religious leaders is where Jesus' conflict is, not with the people as a whole. So, yes, Bob.
Given the times, what options did Pilate have? Could he have just said, this man should be set free?
Yes, I think so. I think that would have been, that Pilate, as the Roman, he had absolute authority in this case. He could have said, I'm going to delay this. I don't want to do this. This man is not guilty. Pilate could easily have done that. And that's where I think that's so significant, wishing to satisfy the crowd.
He sounds weak there.
Yeah.
That's what Pat said, he's a wimp.
He's a wimp. He's a wimp. Yes, over here.
My name is Jill.
Jill.
So in both passages, it says where he knew that it was out of envy.
Yes.
That
Yes.
both of them say that.
In the Matthew?
Yeah, he says that envy on there too.
Number 10 in Mark and 18 in
Yeah.
Matthew.
He knew it was out of envy that they had handed him.
Yes. So Mark is probably the earliest gospel, and then you can see Matthew more or less working from Mark, and so you have a lot of those same pieces. But then there are these expansions which work to kind of clarify the blame a little bit. But those pieces are there still, and the religious leaders are still present as stirring up the crowd. And envy is not what the crowd is going to think, but what the leaders. Yeah. Pat, and then we'll really read.
We know that not everything is in the scriptures. So what is the importance of Pilate's wife's dream? How did they make it into the scriptures since he didn't even act on it?
Well, there's a lot of dreams in Matthew, And Joseph falls asleep and in a dream is told to go to Egypt, and dreams and dreams. And I mean, dreams are important in the Jewish tradition, is the best example. And women get their authority through dreams and visions throughout the tradition. So women, Pilate's wife has no authority, right? She's not ruling anything, but where is she going to get any authority from a vision and a dream? And so that's very important in the Jewish tradition. And I think that's really, it's just a common in Matthew to have dreams. And it's coming from that. Think about, if you're familiar with Fiddler on the Roof, which is my favorite, there's the dream, of Frumacera and all of that. Like, it's, I think about those things. Yeah. So that's where I think the answer for that.
So what we'll do now is read. We're going to read the rest of 15. What I'd ask you all to do is, what are some details that really stick out to you, that maybe draw you in, that you maybe haven't noticed before, and that make you, that seem there to make things vivid or to draw you in, or that you just have a question about. So we'll read, be thinking, and then maybe in kind of a popcorn fashion, hear about what struck you.
We'll take turns.
Okay.
The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the praetorium, and assembled the whole cohort. They clothed him in purple, and weaving a crown of thorns, placed it on him. They began to salute him with, "Hail, King of the Jews," and kept striking his head with a reed and spitting upon him. They knelt before him in homage. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, dressed him in his own clothes, and led him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross.
They brought him to the place of Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. They gave him wine drugged with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his garments by casting lots for them to see what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." With him they crucified 2 revolutionaries, one on his right, one on his left. Those passing by reviled him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself by coming down from the cross." Likewise, the chief priests with the scribes mocked him among themselves and said, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also kept abusing him.
At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of the bystanders who heard it said, "Look, he's calling Elijah." One of them ran, soaked a sponge with wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see if Elijah comes to take him down." Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. The veil of the sanctuary was torn in 2 from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood facing him saw how he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and of Joseph, and Salome. These women had followed him when he was in Galilee and ministered to him. There were also many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
When it was already evening, since it was the day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a distinguished member of the council, who was himself awaiting the kingdom of God, came and courageously went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was amazed that he was already dead. He summoned the centurion and asked him if Jesus had already died. And when he learned of it from the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. Having bought a linen cloth, he took him down, wrapped him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, watched where he was laid. And next week we'll have the resurrection stories, and so that'll be our last week on Mark is next week. But what are some details that were meaningful or that you noticed looking through as we read that? Yeah, Dick.
A lot of emphasis on the women, and also the fact that the mother of Jesus is
Right.
Yeah, do you want to say something about what we were talking about last night about all these Marys?
Yeah. So I was reading. I'm not exactly sure. It was a good source. Was saying that about approximately half the women were named Mary. So you have a lot of Marys at the time. So you have a lot of Marys, but it is, as Dick was saying, the women. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of younger James and Joses. That does not seem to be Mary, the mother of Jesus. It
would have said that if it was.
Right. It would have been hard to avoid that. And Salome. So we have, so the presence of women here is notable.
And then again, like Dick, you said, then there are also many other women who had come up with him for Jerusalem. So there seems to be a real desire here there were women everywhere in this movement, seems to be the point, which I think is well taken.
Mm-hmm. Bob.
Probably safer for the women.
Right, we see Peter basically have to scatter, but the women don't seem to be under that pressure. I didn't thought about that, but that's a great point. Steve? Right. Women turn up in the stations with meeting his mother and then Veronica, right? Jill. Oh, I thought you thought.
I think this allows, throughout the tradition, women to be full participants, to imagine themselves every step of the way along this journey. And I think that, that's one of the things that's really beautiful here, that this is not just for the leaders, just for the men, just for the priests, but this is for all of us in the tradition to be on this path.
Yeah, Sue.
At the beginning of the reading, the first line was, the soldiers led him away inside the palace and assembled the whole cohort. How did the soldiers have the power to gather people together? What does the cohort mean?
I believe that's going to reflect so he's handed over to the Romans to be crucified. So then Jesus is basically in the hands of the Roman soldiers. So there's a scene here with the whole cohort of the Roman soldiers. They've come together and they're just going to have fun with Jesus and mocking and abusing him. So we're in this kind of abusive situation where he's surrounded by soldiers.
Yeah, it struck me reading this, the scorn and the abuse and the mockery seems to be really important for Mark to convey. Striking his head with a reed, spitting on him, knelt before him in homage. You can just imagine them pretend kneeling. Oh, you're so powerful, just mocking, and dressing him up in a fake royalty, purple, the color of royalty. This mockery seems to be a really important part of the story and very, very vivid here.
Yeah, Kevin.
So, just so many times they'll drop a name and her name.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds you that they're writing to an audience. But I guess it never crossed the assignment that they talk about him being father of two.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, we were laughing about this last night too. Like the father of Alexander and Rufus, and you can imagine Alexander and Rufus like, yeah, that's me. That was my dad. We're like right back in this moment with these things, and we skim over this. We're like, we don't know who this is. We don't care. But the people that it was written for did know. This was in their recent memory, and yeah, I love that. I love those details.
Yeah, Sheila, and then.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That obsession or fixation on that is a later addition, This mockery is more important than this physical, scourging as imagined by certain filmmakers, let's say. It's not here. You're right. He's scourged. It's part of the routine that's unpleasant, but it isn't the main part of the story. Absolutely.
Yes, and tell me your name. Terry.
What is the significance of the veil of the sanctuary being torn in two?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about that, as you could imagine. So as you get to the end here, in verse 33, at noon, darkness came over the whole land. So we're not at night, right? We're in noon, and we're at the event, the end times event that the whole of this gospel has been heading towards. So there's this apparently kind of supernatural darkness that falls. And then, as he breathes his last, the veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. And there's a lot of discussion about what exactly that means. Two things that make sense to me is we've seen Jesus kind of presenting himself in opposition to the temple. So he's overturning the tables. We've seen it's reported twice of him in here that he said, tear down this temple and in 3 days I'll build it up, which we understand as a reference to himself, but there's like me versus the temple kind of thing that Jesus has. And here is the decisive moment where that temple is rendered moot. And if you think about, we've talked about, this comes from around 70 AD, when either it's in the immediate forward view or in the immediate backward view, the whole temple is going to be destroyed and razed to the ground, and religion, both for Judaism and Christianity, is going to be a templeless religion. That this is kind of a preview of that the temple is now a moot point. That moot point wasn't in 70 AD. That moot point was when it's actually destroyed. It was made moot by this act of Jesus and this ability. The whole system based around the temple is now going to be replaced. And from the beginning of Mark, we've had the wineskin and the new wine. That is the new wine, is this new faith that we have. I think it's a really significant point and a lot of discussion that it's generated. Bob and then Sheila.
Well, one interpretation, of course, the temple was where God was. No one saw God except the high priest, and this curtain kept people from seeing God. Now it's been opened up.
Yes.
It gives a different insight.
Right. So that's another important interpretation. So you can see there's like several interlocking interpretations. Is that the temple was not something like the Holy of Holies that people could go in, and now access to God isn't a geographical place-based thing. And so that would be.
You can see that this is how the earliest Christians were understanding this event. And like Martyn said, everything in this text that we've been reading for a long time, 18 weeks, is leading to this. This is what he came to do. And the earliest Christians, as I said last week, we didn't get Christianity from these stories. Christianity existed, which is why we have these stories. And so the earliest Christians understood this event as the point, not a terrible detour. Our great religious leader was killed. So sad. No, he came in order to die. And this changed everything. We know that the earliest Christians believed that. So.
I saw Sheila and Steve.
I agree.
Okay.
Agree with Bob. There you go, Bob's like, he likes that.
Steve. Yeah. 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 And I mean, so I think that's true, and that I think is just a growth from what Bob is saying. There's going to be it's hard to separate sometimes the theological reflection on these events from what Mark is seeing things. And so our theological reflection on Jesus and the temple and Jesus living inside us, we are the temple, this language, it's something that's going to develop. In my view, Mark may have been more commenting on the fact that this temple, everyone knows it's going to be flattened. And is that the point where the temple loses significance? And Mark is saying it was here. It was at this moment of death, that was the end of this temple system. I think we're out of time, but we did make some progress. You may have been a doubter at first, but we got through that. Next week will be our last week. On Mark, we're going to talk about the resurrection narratives. Those are actually very complex and interesting in Mark. And then we'll move on to Acts in the week after that. So that's what's coming. Yes.
Don't want to confuse everybody, but we'll be here next week. Okay, we're going to be here next week, so come back next week. But then we're taking a 2-week break because a bunch of us are going on a cruise. Sorry, we're going. Oh yeah, you're not invited. Sorry. I mean, you could come, but anyway. So we'll be here next week, so please come back for the finish of this, and then we'll take a 2-week break so we can get ready for the Acts. How's that?
Well, that is great timing.
And I have a completely unrelated announcement, which is that I'm on the board of Global Outreach, which is the Catholic student exchange from Eastern Europe, bringing the Catholic students in. And yeah, I'm Father Larry, and I'm on the board of that. We get a little bit of we get a stipend from you all, which we donate to them. So I don't know if you knew that you were, contributing to them, but we don't have enough families to host the kids next year. So if you know anybody or you know who has ever mentioned to you, well, it'd be fun to have an exchange student, get them in touch with me through Gary, because we don't want to have to turn these kids down. They're all great kids. They have perfect English, and we had a great time with that, so much so that I joined the board. So just put that out into your communities and your conversations that we're looking for those families. It's for a whole school year, and they would go either to like St. Mary's or to Xavier. Yeah, so it's a big ask, but it's if you know someone, put them in touch with me. Thank you.